In the summer of 1940, Europe seemed to belong to one man. In a matter of weeks, Nazi Germany had crushed Poland, overwhelmed Belgium and the Netherlands, and delivered a stunning defeat to France, an outcome many had thought impossible. Paris had fallen, the French army had collapsed, and now, across the narrow stretch of water known as the English Channel, only one major power remained standing against Adolf Hitler: Britain. To many observers at the time, Britain's position looked desperate. Its army had barely escaped destruction at Dunkirk, leaving behind most of its heavy equipment on the beaches of France. The British Expeditionary Force had been saved, but only just. Weapons were scarce, defenses were incomplete, and the threat of invasion felt more real than ever before. Hitler believed the end was near. With Western Europe under his control, he turned his attention to the island that had long resisted domination. The plan to invade Britain was given a name that sounded almost mythical: Operation Sea Lion. It would be the largest amphibious assault ever attempted, a crossing of the English Channel by German forces to land on British shores and force a surrender. But there was a problem. Unlike the rapid victories on land, this invasion depended on something far less certain: control of the skies. Germany's military machine had been built on speed and surprise. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, relied on close coordination between tanks, infantry, and aircraft. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, played a crucial role in that strategy, smashing enemy defenses ahead of advancing troops. It had proven devastatingly effective in Poland and France. German pilots were experienced, confident, and backed by a formidable fleet of aircraft. Yet crossing the English Channel was a different kind of challenge. The German army could not simply drive into Britain. Troops would have to be transported by sea, exposed and vulnerable, and without air superiority, complete control of the air above the battlefield, those invasion forces could be destroyed before they ever reached land. For Operation Sea Lion to succeed, the RAF had to be defeated. The RAF, as it was known, was all that stood between Britain and invasion. It was smaller than the Luftwaffe, with fewer aircraft and fewer pilots. On paper, the odds did not favor Britain. Many German commanders believed it would take only days to destroy the RAF's ability to resist. But Britain had something Germany did not fully understand. Under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Fighter Command had been carefully organized into an integrated defense system unlike anything the world had seen before. It combined radar stations along the coast, ground observers across the countryside, and centralized command centers that could track incoming enemy formations in real time. Information flowed quickly, allowing British fighters to be directed precisely where they were needed most. Instead of wasting fuel and energy on constant patrols, RAF pilots could wait on the ground until the moment of attack and then rise to meet the enemy with efficiency and coordination. This system would prove to be one of Britain's greatest advantages. The aircraft themselves also played a crucial role. The RAF's backbone consisted of two main fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane was sturdy and reliable, capable of taking damage and still returning home. The Spitfire, sleek and fast, became a symbol of British resistance. Together, they formed a deadly combination. Facing them in the skies were Germany's own formidable machines. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was one of the most advanced fighters of its time, fast and heavily armed. It had dominated the skies over Europe. Alongside it were bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and Dornier DOT-17, designed to strike airfields, cities, and infrastructure deep within enemy territory. The stage was set for a battle unlike any before it. Throughout the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe began its campaign. At first, German attacks focused on shipping and coastal targets, probing Britain's defenses. Then the focus shifted to airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, an all-out effort to destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air. Day after day, waves of German aircraft crossed the Channel. Sirens wailed across southern England as civilians took shelter. In the skies above, young pilots, many barely out of training, were thrown into intense combat, facing experienced German airmen in life-or-death encounters that lasted only minutes. Losses mounted on both sides. Aircraft burned. Pilots bailed out or didn't. For the RAF, every loss mattered. Britain could not afford to replace pilots as quickly as Germany. The pressure was relentless. And yet, the RAF did not break. Despite being outnumbered, British defenses held firm. Radar stations, though targeted, remained operational. Fighter command adapted, repaired, and continued to fight. German intelligence struggled to assess the true strength of the RAF, often believing it was closer to collapse than it really was. This miscalculation would have consequences. As August turned to September, the battle intensified. German strategy began to shift, with increasing attacks on London and other cities. The Blitz had begun. But in focusing on cities, the Luftwaffe eased pressure on the RAF's airfields and infrastructure, giving fighter command a critical opportunity to recover. The outcome of this struggle would hinge on a few decisive moments when decisions, timing, and sheer determination would shape the future of an entire nation. By mid-September, the tension had reached its peak. Both sides prepared for what would become one of the most important days of the entire conflict. The question was no longer whether Britain would be attacked. It was whether it could survive what was coming next. By late summer of 1940, the battle for Britain was no longer just a clash of aircraft in the sky. It had become a test of systems, coordination, and intelligence. What appeared from a distance to be chaotic dogfights was, in reality, something far more controlled on the British side. Behind every interception, every timely scramble, there was an invisible network quietly shaping the outcome of the battle. At the heart of this network was a technology still unfamiliar to much of the world: radar. Stretching along the southeastern coast of Britain stood a chain of tall skeletal towers known as the Chain Home System. These stations emitted radio waves that could detect incoming aircraft from miles away, long before they could be seen or heard. To German planners, radar was either underestimated or misunderstood. Many believed that destroying airfields alone would be enough to cripple British defenses. They were wrong. Radar gave Britain time, something no nation under attack could afford to waste. As German formations gathered over occupied France and began their journey across the Channel, they were already being tracked. Their size, direction, and approximate altitude were reported in real time. But radar alone was not enough. Information had to be processed, understood, and acted upon quickly. This is where Britain's fighter command revealed its true strength. At a headquarters deep underground, reports from radar stations and ground observers were filtered, analyzed, and plotted onto large maps. Small markers represented incoming enemy formations moving steadily toward British airspace. Around these maps stood teams of operators, many of them young women, who updated positions with speed and precision. Orders were then relayed to sector stations, where commanders made rapid decisions: which squadrons to send, how many aircraft to commit, and exactly where to intercept the enemy. For the pilots waiting on the ground, the experience was tense and uncertain. They sat in their aircraft or nearby, listening for the call, engines silent, minds racing. They did not patrol endlessly in the sky. Instead, they waited. And when the order came, it came suddenly: scramble.
Within minutes, pilots were airborne, climbing rapidly toward the altitude and position given to them by ground control. They were not searching blindly. They were being guided, vectored directly into the path of the incoming German formations. This level of coordination was something the Luftwaffe did not possess in the same way. German pilots relied more heavily on visual identification and pre-planned routes. Once in the air, communication was often limited and flexibility was reduced. Their bombers, flying in tight formations for protection, depended on fighter escorts like the Messerschmitt Bf-109. But these escorts had a critical limitation: range. Operating from bases in France and Belgium, German fighters had only a limited amount of time over Britain before fuel forced them to turn back. This meant that bombers were often left exposed at the most dangerous moments, deep over enemy territory. The RAF, on the other hand, was fighting over its own land. Pilots who were shot down had a chance of survival, often returning to fight again within days. German pilots who went down over Britain were lost, captured, or killed. Every engagement carried consequences beyond just the immediate battle. Inside the cockpits, the experience was intense and unforgiving. Pilots had only seconds to react. Speeds exceeded 300 miles per hour. A single mistake could be fatal. There were no guided missiles, no advanced targeting systems, just machine guns, instinct, and training. And yet, despite the pressure, the system worked. British fighters were not wasted on empty skies. They were sent exactly where they were needed, often arriving at the perfect moment to intercept German bombers before they could reach their targets. Even when outnumbered, this efficiency allowed the RAF to hold the line. German commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Reports from their pilots suggested heavy resistance, yet intelligence assessments continued to claim that the RAF was close to collapse. Airfields had been hit, aircraft destroyed. Surely the end was near. But what they could not see was the resilience of the system behind the scenes. Damaged runways were repaired quickly. Replacement aircraft were brought in. Pilots, exhausted but determined, returned to the air again and again. And the radar stations, though attacked, remained largely operational, continuing to provide the early warnings that made everything else possible. This invisible advantage changed the nature of the battle. It meant that Germany could not simply overwhelm Britain with numbers. Every raid was met with resistance. Every formation was tracked. Every mistake was costly. As the days passed, the strain began to show on both sides. For the Luftwaffe, missions became more dangerous, losses more significant. For the RAF, the pressure was constant, the margin for error almost non-existent. And still, the battle continued. By September, the situation had reached a critical point. Germany needed a decisive blow to eliminate the RAF and clear the way for invasion. Britain needed to hold on just long enough to prove that it could not be defeated from the air. Everything now depended on how this system would perform under its greatest test, because soon the largest attacks yet were coming, and the outcome would be decided not just by courage in the skies, but by the unseen network guiding every move below. The morning of September 15, 1940, began with a sense of tension that could be felt across southern England. The skies were clear, the air unusually calm, but beneath that calm was the growing certainty that something massive was about to unfold. British radar stations along the coast were the first to detect it. Large formations of German aircraft were assembling over northern France. Blips began to appear on radar screens, slowly at first, then multiplying. Operators watched as the shapes grew into something unmistakable. This was not a small raid, not a probing attack. This was a full-scale assault. Reports moved quickly through the system. from radar stations to fighter command headquarters, then down to sector airfields. Controllers leaned over their maps, tracking the movement, estimating numbers, calculating routes. Within minutes, the order was given: scrabble. Across airfields in southern England, engines roared to life. Pilots rushed to their aircraft, some already suited and waiting, others sprinting across the grass. Hurricanes and Spitfires lifted into the sky one after another, climbing hard to gain altitude. There was no hesitation now. This was the moment they had been preparing for. As the German formations crossed the English Channel, they came in force, hundreds of bombers, escorted by fighters, moving steadily toward London. From above, it must have looked unstoppable. Tight formations, disciplined, confident. The Luftwaffe had come expecting to deliver a decisive blow. But the RAF was already in position. Guided by ground control, British fighters climbed into the path of the incoming waves. The first visual contacts came quickly, dark shapes against the bright sky, growing larger by the second. Then, without warning, the sky erupted into chaos. Fighters broke formation and accelerated into attack. Machine guns opened fire. Tracers cut across the sky in bright, deadly lines. Bombers held their course as long as they could, gunners firing back from every direction. Escort fighters dove to intercept the attackers, turning the battle into a swirling, fast-moving storm of aircraft. For the pilots inside those cockpits, everything happened at once. There was no time to think, only to react. One moment you were scanning the sky, the next you were diving, climbing, firing, trying to stay alive while keeping your target in sight. The noise was constant. Engines screaming at full power, gunfire rattling through the airframe, the wind tearing past the canopy, and always the awareness that a single burst of fire could end everything. Some RAF pilots focused on the bombers, knowing they were the true threat. Others engaged the German fighters, trying to draw them away and create openings. Coordination mattered, but so did instinct. Every decision was made in seconds. Below them, London waited. Civilians looked up as the distant hum of engines grew louder. Air raid sirens began to sound. People moved toward shelters, glancing nervously at the sky. They could not see the full scale of the battle above them, but they could feel it coming. Back in the air, the first wave of German bombers began to lose formation. Under constant attack, some were forced to drop their bombs early. Others pressed on, determined to reach their targets. But the resistance was far stronger than expected. RAF squadrons rotated in and out of the fight, landing to refuel and rearm, then taking off again to rejoin the battle. Ground crews worked with incredible speed, turning aircraft around in minutes. Every second counted. Despite their numbers, the German formations were being disrupted. Escort fighters struggled to maintain control. The range limitations of the Bf-109 meant that time was always against them. The deeper they flew into British airspace, the less time they had to protect the bombers. And when they turned back, even briefly, the bombers were left vulnerable. Losses began to mount. Aircraft were hit, trailing smoke as they fell away from the formation. Some pilots bailed out, parachutes opening against the sky. Others did not get the chance. The channel below and the English countryside became scattered with wreckage. Still, the attack continued. For hours, the battle raged across the skies of southern England. It was not one single fight, but dozens happening at once, intersections of speed, timing, and survival. Every new radar report brought fresh squadrons into action. Every passing minute increased the strain on both sides. And yet, something was becoming clear. The Luftwaffe had expected to face a weakened enemy. Instead, they encountered a defense that was organized, resilient, and relentless. The RAF was not collapsing. It was adapting, responding, and holding its ground. As the morning wore on, the first wave of attacks began to lose momentum. German formations, scattered and damaged, started to withdraw. Survivors turned back toward France, their mission incomplete. But the day was far from over. Both sides knew this was only the beginning. because even as the smoke cleared from the first wave, new formations were already preparing to cross the channel. The next phase of the battle was coming, and it would be even more intense than the first.
By the early afternoon of September 15, 1940, there was no pause, no moment to recover. The first wave had barely withdrawn when new reports began flooding into fighter command. Radar stations picked up fresh formations, gathering once again over occupied France, even larger this time. The pattern was clear. Germany was not backing down. They were preparing to strike again, harder, deeper, and with the full weight of their air power. Inside the operations rooms, the atmosphere tightened. Controllers tracked the incoming formations as they grew on the maps, markers clustering together into a massive force heading toward London. The scale of the second assault left little doubt. This was meant to finish the job. Orders were issued quickly. Squadrons that had just landed were being refueled and rearmed at record speed. Pilots who had already fought once that day climbed back into their cockpits, some barely catching their breath. Fatigue was setting in, but there was no choice. If they didn't go back up, there would be nothing left to defend. Again, the call went out. Scramble. Engines roared across southern England as fighters took to the air for the second time in just a few hours. The sky that had briefly fallen silent was filling once more with the sound of war. As the RAF climbed to meet the incoming force, the size of the German formation became impossible to ignore. Hundreds of aircraft moved in coordinated waves, bombers in tight groups, fighters weaving above and around them. From a distance, it must have looked overwhelming. But the British response was already in motion. Guided with precision from the ground, RAF squadrons positioned themselves ahead of the German approach. This time, the interceptions came even faster. The moment the enemy crossed into range, British fighters struck. What followed was one of the most intense air battles ever seen. The sky over London turned into a battlefield of fire and motion. Aircraft crossed paths at high speed, climbing, diving, twisting through clouds of smoke and tracer fire. Explosions flashed in the distance as bombers were hit. Trails of black smoke marked aircraft struggling to stay airborne. For the pilots, the exhaustion of the morning now mixed with adrenaline. Muscles ached, reactions slowed, but the urgency of the moment overpowered everything. They knew what was at stake. Below them was the capital. Behind them, their homes. There was no room for retreat. RAF pilots pressed their attacks with determination, breaking through fighter escorts to reach the bombers. Some came in head-on, firing directly into the approaching formations. Others attacked from above or behind, aiming for engines, wings, anything that would bring the bombers down. German gunners fired back relentlessly. The air around the bombers was filled with defensive fire, making every approach dangerous. A single hit could shatter a cockpit, tear through a wing, or ignite fuel in seconds. And still, the attacks continued. Coordination began to break down within the German formations. Under constant pressure, bombers were forced to maneuver, losing the tight structure that had protected them. Fighter escorts struggled to keep control, pulled in multiple directions by the aggressive RAF attacks. The limitations of range once again became critical. German fighters, low on fuel, could not remain over London for long. Some were forced to turn back earlier than planned, leaving the bombers exposed at the most dangerous point of their mission. Others stayed too long, risking the chance of not making it back across the channel at all. Piece by piece, the formation began to unravel. On the ground, observers watched as damaged aircraft fell from the sky. Some crashed into open fields, others into the outskirts of the city. Parachutes appeared overhead, some drifting safely down, others never opening. In the operations rooms, reports confirmed what was becoming increasingly clear. The Luftwaffe was taking heavy losses. Despite their numbers, they were not breaking through in the way they had expected. Bombs were dropped, but often inaccurately, released early under pressure, or scattered by evasive maneuvers.
The concentrated, decisive strike they had planned was slipping away, and the RAF was still there, still intercepting, still fighting, still holding the line. As the battle stretched into the late afternoon, the intensity began to shift. German formations, now disorganized and depleted, started to withdraw. The sky slowly cleared, though the signs of the battle remained. Smoke drifting across the horizon, distant fires burning below, and the lingering echo of engines fading into silence. For the second time that day, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its objective. But this failure was different. It was no longer just a matter of resistance, it was a turning point. German commanders had expected to destroy the RAF, to open the way for invasion. Instead, they had encountered a defense that refused to collapse, a system that continued to function under extreme pressure, and pilots who returned to the fight again and again despite the odds. The cost of continuing the campaign was becoming harder to ignore. As evening approached, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. The largest attacks had been launched, the strongest effort had been made, and Britain was still standing.
As the sun began to set on September 15, 1940, the skies over Britain finally grew quiet. The roar of engines faded, the trails of smoke thinned, and what remained was the aftermath of a day that had pushed both sides to their limits. For those on the ground, the silence felt almost unreal. In London and across southern England, people emerged cautiously from shelters. They looked up at the sky that, just hours before, had been filled with fire and destruction. Some buildings were damaged, fires still burned in places, and the cost of the day was visible. But something far more important had survived. Britain had not fallen. Across RAF airfields, the scene was one of exhaustion mixed with quiet relief. Pilots climbed out of their aircraft, some physically shaken, others saying very little at all. Ground crews moved quickly, checking damage, counting returning planes, noting who had made it back and who had not. There were empty spaces where aircraft should have been, empty bunks that would not be filled that night. But there was also something else. The realization that they had faced the full force of the Luftwaffe and held. Reports began to come in, slowly at first, then with greater clarity. German losses had been significant, dozens of aircraft destroyed, many more damaged. For the Luftwaffe, the cost of the day was far higher than expected. And perhaps more importantly, the objective had not been achieved. The RAF was still operational. Fighter command was still intact. Radar stations continued to function. Airfields, though damaged, were far from destroyed. The system that Germany had tried to break was still working. For Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, this posed a serious problem. Operation Sea Lion depended on air superiority. Without it, any attempt to cross the English Channel would be dangerously exposed to attack from the air and sea. German transport vessels, slow and vulnerable, would be easy targets for the Royal Navy and the RAF. The events of September 15 made one thing clear: air superiority had not been won. In the days that followed, German strategy began to shift. The focus moved increasingly toward bombing cities rather than targeting the RAF directly. The Blitz would continue, bringing destruction to London and other urban centers. But the goal had changed. Instead of preparing for immediate invasion, Germany was now attempting to weaken British morale, to force a surrender through sustained bombing. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, then quietly set aside. The invasion that had seemed so close never came. September 15 would later be remembered as Battle of Britain Day, not because it ended the conflict in a single moment, but because it marked the point where the outcome began to turn. It was the day when the Luftwaffe failed to break Britain's defenses at a critical moment, a day when expectation collided with reality. For the pilots who fought in the sky, it was just one of many missions.
They would continue to fly, to face danger again and again in the weeks and months ahead. But history would look back and recognize what had been achieved in those 13 hours. They had prevented invasion. They had forced a change in strategy, and they had shown that Nazi Germany could be resisted and stopped. The significance of that moment extended far beyond Britain itself. Had the island fallen, the balance of power in Europe would have shifted dramatically. It would have changed the course of the war and possibly the world that followed. Instead, Britain remained a base of operations, a symbol of resistance, and a critical ally in the years to come. The battle did not end that day. The war was far from over. But something fundamental had changed. The idea of an unstoppable German advance had been broken. And from that point forward, the path to victory, however long and difficult, remained open. All because, on one decisive day, against overwhelming odds, Britain held the line.